A Beginner's Guide to Malnutrition, by Doctors Without Borders. On average, the human body needs more than 2,100 kilocalories per day to lead a normal, healthy life. Adequate nutrition is essential for the physical development and maintenance of the body as well as resistance to disease, ability to learn and energy to work. Malnutrition is defined as an imbalance between the body's supply of nutrients and the body's demand for growth, maintenance, and specific activities. When a person cannot take in sufficient nutrients to meet their needs, the body begins to waste away. First they lose fat, and then muscle. Malnutrition is not measured by how much food is eaten, but by physical measurements such as weight and height. Malnutrition in children is often measured by comparing their weight measurement with what would be expected for someone their height. Once a child has fallen below 80% of the weight that is average for their height, they are defined as acutely malnourished. Swellings on both feet, known as bilateral edema, are also a sure symptom of malnourishment in children. If children are undernourished over a long period of time, their growth may be stunted. This is known as chronic malnutrition. If they experience rapid weight loss, or wasting, over a short period of time, they are described as suffering from acute malnutrition. Even if people have sufficient quantities of food to eat, they can become malnourished if their food does not provide the right amount of macronutrients, proteins, fats and sugars, and micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. In other words, malnourishment is to do with the quality as well as the quantity of food. Malnutrition and disease can interact in a vicious cycle. Inadequate food intake results in the body being increasingly sensitive to infections. Infections often lead to poor appetite and nausea, resulting in reduced food intake, and can also impair the body's ability to absorb nutrients. In turn, malnutrition weakens the immune system and increases the incidence, severity, and duration of infections. This dangerous cycle can ultimately lead to death. Young children are more vulnerable to malnutrition than adults, for several reasons. Children are growing, so their relative needs for nutrients are greater. Because they are not able to ingest large bulky meals, they need small frequent feeds, which mothers may not be able to provide during emergency situations. Children are especially susceptible to malnutrition when they are weaned from their mother's breast milk to a diet deficient in protein and other nutrients. Pregnant and breastfeeding women are also particularly vulnerable to malnutrition since extra energy is needed during pregnancy and lactation. Types of malnutrition. Macronutrient deficiency. The most common form of malnutrition, called marasmus, occurs when an individual is unable to take in a sufficient quantity of food in general. Children with marasmus are severely wasted, with no fat and very little muscle tissue left on their body. They often appear old and shriveled and have prominent ribs and limb joints. They are left with almost no subcutaneous fat and their internal organs, including the heart and the blood, are weakened. With no reserves to fight infection, illnesses such as pneumonia, diarrhea, and measles can be fatal. The second common type of malnutrition in children is kwashiorkor, which is specifically caused by a lack of protein energy in certain micronutrients in the diet. Symptoms of kwashiorkor include a swollen abdomen, severe anemia, and edema, swellings of the feet, legs and arms which can make up 30% of a child's body weight. Another distinctive symptom is hair turning red and falling out. Like marasmus, kwashiorkor kills by lowering resistance to infection. However, it can also be fatal in its own right, because it disturbs levels of salts and minerals in the body. Micronutrient deficiency. Other forms of malnutrition result from vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Micronutrients are necessary in small quantities to ensure proper metabolic functioning. Vitamin A deficiency weakens the immune systems of a large proportion of under-5s in poor countries, increasing their vulnerability to diseases such as diarrhea, measles, and malaria. Lack of vitamin A can also lead to eye diseases and eventually blindness. Iodine is necessary for the thyroid to function normally and for development of the nervous system during the first trimester of pregnancy. Iodine deficiency results in goiter and cretinism, associated with severe mental retardation and physical stunting. Vitamin B1 deficiency can lead to beriberi. There are several different types of the disease, which can affect the nervous system and heart and cause gastrointestinal problems. It often occurs when white rice is the staple food in a population's diet. Lack of vitamin C can lead to scurvy. It mainly occurs when people have little access to fresh fruit and vegetables. Vitamin B3 deficiency leads to pellagra, which is indicated by diarrhea, dementia and skin lesions, often around the neck. Causes of nutrition crises. Poverty. We are used to seeing images of malnutrition in the context of high-profile crises such as droughts and wars. In fact, the vast majority of the estimated 800 million hungry people in the world are not the victims of sudden, abnormal incidents, but rather endure long-term, chronic malnutrition as a result of poverty. The poverty-stricken do not have enough money to buy or produce enough food for themselves and their families. Poor farmers cannot afford to buy land, seeds, equipment or water. Craftsmen lack the means to pay for the tools to ply their trade. Poor regions of the world lack key agricultural infrastructure such as irrigation equipment, storage facilities and roads and vehicles to transport food. The hunger gap. In many places, malnourishment occurs in regular cycles, according to the seasons and the harvesting time of year. Populations experience seasonal food shortages or hunger gaps. For farmers, this usually occurs before a harvest season when food stocks from previous harvests have been exhausted and market prices are high. For pastoral populations, it often occurs at the end of a dry season, when grazing areas are scarce and epidemics in livestock are prevalent. Food distribution mechanisms. Famine and food crises do not necessarily occur because of an absolute lack of food in a particular region. Inequalities built into mechanisms for distributing food and the economic incentives that drive food markets can create severe food shortages. If it is more profitable for farmers to sell their produce to other regions or abroad rather than to the local market, the poor in the region may have no access to food, even if lots is being produced locally. Local producers may also stockpile food until the hunger gap period in order to sell it at inflated prices when people are most desperate. Food crises can also be the deliberate or unintentional result of government policy. Repressive governments can manipulate food availability in certain regions in order to suppress their opponents and the populations that support them. In other cases, food crises are the consequence of a lack of governance, when civil disorder causes food distribution mechanisms to break down completely. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen famously noted in the 1980s, no functioning democracy has ever suffered from a famine. War. There are many ways in which war can lead to a nutritional crisis. Combatants frequently loot or destroy the food supplies of their enemies and systematically wreck local markets. Fields and water wells are mined and contaminated, land is requisitioned for military purposes, and stocks are stolen to feed militias or armies. People are forced to abandon their land because of the threat of violence and find it impossible to return to sow and harvest because of insecurity. Natural disasters. Drought due to failure of the rains is a common cause of large-scale food crises. Drought can lead to failure of crops and death of livestock. Problems are often exacerbated by poor agricultural practices such as overfarming and overgrazing of land. Environmental problems such as soil erosion, desertification and deforestation also threaten fertile farmland. Tropical storms, earthquakes and floods can destroy crops and food stocks and damage the infrastructure and equipment needed to produce and transport food. Cultural practices can play a significant role in determining the nutritional status of sectors of a population. In some societies, men are traditionally given priority in food allocation. This can lead to a greater risk of women becoming malnourished, particularly those of reproductive age who lose iron during their monthly periods and require more energy, protein and micronutrients during pregnancy and breastfeeding. Breastfeeding and weaning practices can also have a crucial influence in child nutrition. For example, traditional weaning foods in West Africa such as maize and cereal, pap, are of low nutritional value in terms of protein and energy. In some areas, the early introduction of solid foods and unhygienic feeding practices result in malnutrition, growth retardation and infection. Some communities also believe that depriving children of food can cure them of diseases such as measles. Environmental factors. Environmental factors can considerably aggravate nutritional crises. Poor water quality, a lack of sanitation and inadequate public health services can all contribute significantly to the deterioration of a community's nutritional status by increasing the prevalence of health problems such as diarrhea and dysentery. Stages of food crises. Food security means the ability of the household to secure, either from its own production or through purchases, adequate food for meeting the dietary needs of all members of the household. Food security is determined by whether food is available, accessible, and affordable. It is also determined by whether that food can actually be utilized, which depends on the availability of firewood, utensils, tools, water, and so on. Food insecurity is a situation in which a population does not have sustainable access to sufficient food to meet dietary needs. Food insecurity is usually temporary. Households are generally able to resume viable livelihoods once the food situation has improved. When food access and/or availability deteriorates, food insecurity can worsen to famine. The process generally occurs in 3 stages. Food insecurity turns into food crisis, then food crisis turns into famine. Food crises are caused by unexpected severe food shortages. In non-conflict situations, food crises can be prompted by a gradual deterioration of food access caused by prolonged or repeated droughts, flooding, large livestock epidemics, economic crisis, etc. In conflict situations, communities may experience sudden reductions in food availability due to forced population movement, destruction or looting of crops and livestock, unsafe access to markets, etc. In such circumstances, people turn to coping mechanisms, for example reducing the number of meals they eat per day and eating food which wouldn't normally be part of their diet, such as leaves. They may be forced to sell goods essential to their future livelihood, e.g. cattle. Once this stage is reached, a return to normal livelihood is difficult since their future productive capacity has been compromised. If the situation worsens, community structures collapse, skilled and educated people, including health staff, migrate, and there is a reduction of support to non-productive members of households such as the elderly and disabled. Such periods are also characterized by the increased marginalization of non-productive people, orphans, beggars, etc. Famine is an absolute lack of food affecting a large population for a long time period. There are very few situations today in which a famine can be considered a purely natural disaster. Drought, flood, and other environmental factors can of course lead to food shortage, but there are almost always human forces at work as well, such as war, an unstable political and economical environment, and the forced displacement of populations. During a famine, households are destitute and no longer have coping mechanisms to fall back on. People often leave their homes in search of food, an event known as distress migration. In a famine, insufficient food and poor health care are the leading causes of death for severely and moderately malnourished people. A common indicator of a famine is that the mortality rate is high for adults as well as children. How you can send food directly to an orphanage. Follow the easy 1-2-3 step system. Step 1. Find an orphanage in a poor part of the world. Step 2. Find a local grocery store or food wholesaler that can deliver. Step 3. Place the order and have it delivered. It's really that easy. Remember that it is best to contact the orphanage first to make sure they are willing to accept the food donation.